Hello! The purpose of this screencast is to teach you how to use the interview question organizer. If you recall, really early on in the process, you read an MNOpedia article on your topic and you were simply asked to ask a bunch of questions. Well, now you're going to start really thinking about the questions you want to ask during your interview. So, when you complete the interview question organizer, what you're doing is you're developing the questions your interviewer will use on the script and in the performance. So you're starting to think about that process. All right, as we step into today or into this assignment, you have just completed the scenario. So you and your partner have a pretty good sense of what direction you're going to take your interview and what circumstances bring your interviewer and your interviewee together. I got some good emails on this. One person is going into a wax museum, and just like the movie Night at the Museum, the character or the topic comes to life, and then the interviewer is able to ask him or her questions, which I think is a pretty good scenario for an interview. It's a clever way of making a person who is dead come back to life. So you've completed the interview scenario. Now you're actually, and you already have because you're watching this screencast, but you're jumping back up here to the interview question organizer. You're watching the screencast now, and let's blow this up so it's a little clearer. One partner is going to create the document, and the name of the document is Interview Question Organizer. So he or she is going to click down here, open up the one with his or her name in the front of it. Then that person is going to share the document with the other partner. So you two need to have a conversation of who's going to open it and who's going to leave the other one just alone. And then you share the single document that you're going to work on. So together, you are going to be creating the little and big questions for the interview. So both of you are working on the same document. This is exactly the same as the combined notes and the interview scenario. So you're pretty used to doing this by now. And it allows me to use Classroom as a way to check your work. So where do we go from here? Well, you're going to click on Interview Question Organizer, but you will have an example down here from me, which I'm going to complete some of this right now for you so you have a launching off point to start from or refer back to. All right, so Biff just opened up his interview question organizer. His name would be right here, Biff McGee. Okay, but this one says example, but imagine it says Biff McGee, and Biff needs to share this with Maud. So Biff's going to share this with Maud. Maud, of course, is not creating her own document. She's waiting to get an email from Biff saying that she can edit it, and then the two of them can work on it together after Biff sends send. Now that the document is shared between the two of you, both of you can start working on it. Ideally, you want to work on this at the same time. So if both of you are together, you can work off each other digitally, even though you're not in the same space. One good thing to use, which I didn't talk about earlier, is if you want to make a comment on something. This says add comment. Some of you are aware of this, but let's say your partner puts something that you have a question about. All I got to do is click on that add comment. What are you talking about? Okay, and you can add that comment. All right, so that's one way that you can have a dialogue back and forth digitally. Now, back to our document. So it says Minnesota interviews, interview question organizer. My topic, or Biff's topic, is Dred and Harriet Scott. Okay, and students will use the little questions column to create a list of questions for the above category. So, example of an above category is early life, background, family, education, and death. And I can see that that's right here. So all of these questions, which in red is where you type, are questions that focus on early life, background, family, education, death. Each one's got 6 places to write in. You can add more. In fact, I encourage you to add more. You may have 10 to 15 questions when it's all said and done. The more, the merrier. Next, it says create 2 larger overarching questions that sum up the little questions. That's over here. 2 big questions about early life, death, family, background, education. And I write those 2 big questions here. These are the 2 questions that more than likely are going to end up on your interview script that your interviewer will ask the interviewee or the topic. So let's get started. Since I am doing Dred and Harriet Scott, I'm going to ask some really basic questions about life and background first. So, when was Dred Scott born? Where was Dred Scott born? Who was Dred Scott's master? Because he was an enslaved person, the person who, air quotes, owns him is called his master. Another question, I might jump into family. Does Dred Scott have any siblings? Did Dred Scott get married and have children? Now I might want to go into education. What types of education does an enslaved person receive? Okay, now you notice that I still haven't asked all the questions I want to ask. I might want to ask, what types of jobs do or does an enslaved person perform? When did Dred Scott die? Okay, so, got some questions here. I hope that you have more than this. And just off the top of my head, I came up with 6, 7, 8 questions here. But they really are lumped together in different categories. And I see 2 big categories here. So when my interviewer comes to actually do the interview, he or she's not going to ask all these little individual questions. It's going to sound way too robotic. Rather, he or she is going to ask these 2 questions, and Dred Scott in the interview, the person playing Dred Scott, will then fill in the gaps by answering these questions. So one question I might want to ask is, Dred, or I should say Mr. Scott, what was your family life like before the court case? Family life is a little too specific, so why don't I say, Mr. Scott, what was your life like before the court case? Because then he can tell me when he's born and where he was born and who his master was and if he had any siblings, if he was ever married and if he had children. He can even start getting into these other topics. And depending on the scenario that I create, he might even be able to tell me when he dies, or the interviewer could say that afterwards or something along those lines. You can be clever with that. The next big topic I see is I got all these life questions here. But then right here, I get more into slavery. So I may want to ask a question like, Mr. Scott, what was your life like as an enslaved person? Okay, so these are 2 big questions that these little ones will then be able to, in other words, the answers to these little questions help answer these big questions. Let's skip down. Connection to Minnesota. This is a little bit of a tougher topic, especially for Dred Scott. He didn't spend much time in Minnesota or Minnesota territory, but he did have an impact on Minnesota history because his court case was here. So I could ask, How did people in MN respond to the court case? I could ask again. How did people in MN respond to the decision? I could get simple. What brought Mr. Scott or Dred Scott to MN? How long was Dred Scott in MN? Let's see. Was the court case held in MN? And I know the answers to these questions because I've done a lot of the research, but now I'm thinking of questions that the interviewer might want to know. My final one could be, did the abolition movement in MN increase after the case? So I got some small questions here, and then I want to think of big questions. So my big question, one of my first big ones, might want to be, how did the Dred Scott decision impact Minnesota? How did the Dred Scott decision impact the abolition movement? In Minnesota. So those are my two big questions, and all these little ones here will be answered when I ask Mr. Scott these big questions. You're going to want to do the same thing along with your partner for major events and accomplishments. You're also going to want to do this for the times in which he or she lived. This you may have a ton of questions because you've studied 3 major events that went on during the person's life. And then legacy, impact. You may have a couple questions here. Sometimes you got to stretch yourself to get 6, but come up with 2 questions about the impact of this person's life on Minnesota or on American history, which you can think of. Don't you have your 2 questions right there? How did you impact Minnesota history? How did you impact U.S. history? Maybe that will be helpful. So you want to have this completely done, at least 6 questions on the little question side, definitely 2 big questions on this side. Hint, hint, these big questions are eventually going to be put on your script. So the interviewer is going to ask them. So it's okay to say Mr. Scott or whoever you're interviewing in your questions. Okay, I didn't do it here, but it is okay to do it there because then you can just copy paste later on when you're creating your script. So, to review, one partner is going to create this document. That partner is going to share the document with the other partner. Together they're going to work on creating an organized list of questions that can be asked during the interview. And really they want 10 solid questions, 2 from each category. Here's our different categories on the right column, so that there's an even distribution of questions across the board. All right, if you have any questions, make sure you email your teacher. Thank you for listening.